Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Welcome to The Open Door. Jim Hanink here with co-host Mario Ramos-Reyes, good friend John Breen, and joining us today are Brian Talbot and Skylar Kovich. We'll be discussing the new education plank of the American Solidarity Party. Let's begin in prayer. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful, and kindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you will renew the face of the earth. Lord, by the light of the Holy Spirit, you have taught the hearts of your faithful. In the same Spirit, help us to relish what is right and always rejoice in your consolation. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Brian, could you first, two things. First, tell us a bit about your own teaching experience, and then tell us about how Skylar and you worked to fashion the education plank that we'll be talking about.
All right. Well, my own personal teaching experience. I am in my third year as a professional educator here in the great state of Texas. I started off about 2-3 years ago as a paraprofessional in a special education classroom, a severe needs special education classroom. And last year got my first full-time teaching job as a special education teacher in a Title I school doing inclusion support. So I'm supporting kids with disabilities in regular general education classrooms. But I've really been kind of doing teaching things throughout my life. I did a lot of informal teaching when I was in the Boy Scouts, teaching skills, life-saving skills and other skills. Just all these random opportunities throughout my life to do that. As for the second question, once we were all elected delegates, this past delegate convention that we had about last month, I knew as an educator, one of the first things I wanted to do was I wanted to make sure that the education platform was something very, very solid, very strong, and overall sound like it's actually written by educators. Yep. I think I said something, John.
Yeah. Anything to add to that, Skylar, about the formation of the platform plank?
Right. So it was definitely a difficult process to figure out who would be working on what. I'm not sure if that part has been brought up as much on this show before, but for a while, education was really tied to the life and family section. And there were attempts to put a team together that would be focusing on all of those sections. But after a while, I think Brian early on created a draft of the education section, and then I had some ideas as well. And eventually, Brian and I got together to figure out what are some of the planks that we could largely agree on. You know, what planks do we have overlapping text that we just needed to merge some of the different ideas into, and what were the few areas where we felt that there couldn't be enough agreement. And so most of the education section really is that. There was a bit more negotiation with all of the delegates on the last plank about sex education. And so, as most of you may know, I do have education experience myself at the college level. I was teaching for about 10 years college political science courses at 2 public colleges in Southern California. And also being totally blind since birth, I have a lot of personal experience as a student in a variety of types of schools when it comes to education for the disabled. But in addition to my own experience, I was also trying to figure out what are all the different ideas that people have about education in the party. That there are lots of people in the party who have various kinds of educational experiences, and there are 3 or 4 quite different views of education. And so I wanted to respect all of the different ideas that people have and find something that everybody could be proud of, while also not being afraid to be radical in some sense.
You had a lot of work to do, and Brian had a lot of work to do. Let me begin simply by reading the first couple of sentences for the education plank and see what Mario, see what John have by way of initial reactions. I know there's one question I'd like to ask. We have a whole bunch of bullet points, but let's begin with, let's call it the proto-preamble. Education is vital to the formation of the human person and the good of society. The American Solidarity Party advocates for affordable, diverse, and well-rounded educational options. Now, that's short enough, but our auditors, gentle listeners that they are, don't have, I imagine, don't have the plank in front of them. So I'm going to read it one more time. Education is vital to the formation of the human person and the good of society. The American Solidarity Party advocates for affordable, diverse, and well-rounded educational options. Mario, what's your initial reaction? Be sure you're unmuted there, Mario.
Well, my initial reaction is when I hear that the American Solidarity Party advocates for affordable, diverse, and well-rounded educational options. I'm wondering about what is the philosophy of education of that party. It seems to me that the party is concerned by, or is concerned for pragmatic reasons about money, affordable, also diverse or diversity. Perhaps it's not clarified what does that mean, and also well-rounded educational options. But those terms, I'm not sure what they mean. What is the philosophy of education behind those terms?
All right. Starting off with questions of clarification. Brian, what do you think about that?
All right. Well, when I read that, the things that come to mind for me, when talking about affordable, just basically that education is accessible for all children and all students. I mean, there are parts of our country where, unfortunately, education, like a good quality education, is not affordable. Like there are areas where the public schools are not well funded, so the education they get there, while it is something, is not of a great caliber. And to really have a good education and be a well-rounded member of society ready to contribute to society can cost quite a bit. So really, when I think of the affordable portion, I'm thinking more about the fact that education is accessible. As going on well-rounded and diverse, what I really think about there is not only just the content of what students are learning, having a well-rounded curriculum, but as well as the options. I mean, as we know, no two children are the same, no two students are the same, and that goes especially for educational styles and learning styles. So to have so really what we're talking about there is thinking about what's going to best fit the child. And that's really, really, in my opinion, talking about the educational setting. So whether it's a public school, a private school, a religious school, the parents homeschooling the child, just really emphasizing that there are a variety of options for parents and families to think about when educating their children, and what's really going to work best for the student, so they can then go ahead and be a well-functioning member of society.
Okay, now you mentioned, Brian, that you're in Texas, and our good friend John Breen just did a teaching stint in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. So he might have some wintry observations, but at any rate, we'll have some geographical diversity. John, what do you make of the proto preamble for the education plank?
Wi-Fi area, because I didn't really catch everything you were saying there. So, would you mind pitching the question again one more time?
All right. You're fit, ready, and rested. So, what do you think, coming from the other end of the country, what do you think about the preamble, just the two sentences that set the stage for the party's education plank?
I don't think it's really specific enough. Kind of echoing what Senor Reyes was saying there. I would have wanted to see something more to the effect that we recognize that parents are the primary educators of their children, and as such, due to their responsibility as parents, they should have the right to choose what education avenue is best for their children. So that's something that I would have wanted to start off with.
But we have that, don't we? In the very first bullet point, says,
right.
Responsibility for the education of children resides primarily in the family. Families should be free to homeschool their children or send them to public or private schools. Would that satisfy you then?
Isn't that a subsequent point, though?
Yes, it's the very first point that we have as we list the particulars.
But
okay. I don't have the planks in front of me. Then, to be quite honest, I am not really prepared for the conversation.
Yeah, but you're going to be our man on the street. You're going to be our man on the street. So our man on the street,
quite literally,
our man on the street wants to hear what comes next, and I think it's right here. Responsibility for the education of children resides primarily in the family. Families should be free to homeschool their children or send them to public or private schools. So would that satisfy you?
Yeah, it satisfies. I probably would have listed that. I would probably have that as the beginning sentence, but maybe that's just a matter of opinion.
It's number 2. It's pretty close to the top. Skylar, what would you add at this point?
Yeah, so I think I was mainly responsible for writing that preamble, and I felt, yes, it is a priority to make sure that there's support for education being the responsibility of the family and for homeschooling, but I thought that it was better to keep the preamble concise and short, number 1, and then to look at the what are the main questions that we're dealing with in the education section. So and I think that affordability, diversity, and well-roundedness gets at that pretty well. So number 1, how much does it cost? Number 2, how is the education being done? So that's where I understand diversity might not necessarily be a wording that would be what everyone would want, but diversity does get at the fact that we have different educational options, as Brian said, and then the well-roundedness is about what exactly is being learned, and I think the first sentence as well, that education being vital to the human person, that gets at a lot of the education educational philosophy that we would like all schools to be thinking about, and that gets at a lot of the discussion in the rest of the section.
All right, now let me push a little bit more on the diverse term. It seems to me that there are a number of educational settings where there is a pretty good racial diversity. There's a pretty good economic diversity, but whether there's any real intellectual diversity, or we could say aspirational diversity, well, maybe it's there, but I don't know that it's much addressed in forming the student body. I just will give the example that I'm most familiar with. I taught for 40 years at an allegedly Jesuit school, which I call the Institute for Higher Earnings. I think that the great majority of the students were there because they thought they would get a better job, really. And very few, I think, were there because they wanted somehow to develop the kind of humanist background that I would associate with liberal arts education. And I don't know what would be involved in getting some educational diversity that would reach beyond income and race and talk about such things as what the students are hoping for and, well, their intellectual diversity.
Well,
open to anybody.
Yeah, I guess that's one reason. One of the most controversial policy ideas is vouchers, which we do. We do come out for some government support for students who want to go to private schools, or whose families want them to go to private schools. Now, there are a couple of critiques of vouchers from within the party. Number one, that they might result in less funding for public schools, and number two, that the government can then have some control over those schools in a way that we would not prefer. But we tend to think the vouchers do more good than harm. And then the other side of it is some of the discussion about how we can elevate learning in all schools, which includes more funding. It includes making it so that the curriculum is more teacher-driven and less test-driven, less technology in the classroom, because we think, there's a lot of educational experts who think that the amount of technology has really gotten out of hand. And then back to the affordability, we talk about the cost of higher education and the student debt crisis. And there's also a plank adding some of the particular subjects that should be in our education system, including, beyond academia.
All right.
But
Mario, you
yes.
started us off on zeroing in on these terms. What do you have to say about whether we've clarified things?
Well, I don't think it's being clarified yet, because I understand that the proposal focus on means. How then we achieve education? How education is affordable? What type of education are we talking about? Well-rounded. But what is the end of education? And I think education must be seen in the context of the political party, which is the American Solidarity Party, which sponsors a very specific, or propose a very specific type of ideas. And those ideas, I think, are key in understanding what we propose. And yes, at the center is the human person. But then how then we regenerate? How then we pass on the tradition of what is the human person? What is the model of the human person that we're looking for? What is our philosophy of education in general? That's what I'm looking for. Yes, then we can talk about whether it's elementary, whether it's higher education, but we need to have an idea, what is that human being that we are looking for? That's my concern. It's yes, we focus on means, which I understand because that's the concern of many people. But then there is a difference between private and public. Which one is going to be more expensive? That is a question then we can discuss about policies. But what I'm observing is about what is the goal of the education in the context of the American Solidarity Party? Because if I change that phrase and I say, well, the Democratic Party advocate for affordable, diverse, and well-rounded educational option, probably will fit many parties. Because we are focused on means. But the issue for us is we have a unique idea of what a human being is, which probably is not shared by the other parties. That was my observation.
Have you been able to read the planks that come after the preamble?
Yes, I read every single bullet point. Yes.
Well, let's look at that first bullet item, and we saw what it says, but let's look at it again, especially with this perspective of what's our broader educational philosophy and what do we see as actually vital to the formation of the human person. So we have responsibility for the education of children resides primarily in the family. Families should be free to homeschool their children or send them to public or private schools. Now let's take the Democratic Party. I can't imagine the Democrats having in their education section of their platform anything positive about homeschooling. Perhaps the Republicans would, but I can't imagine the Democrats doing that. So right away, that seems to me to bring us closer to something that's distinctively Solidarity Party.
Right. Yes, when you read the second claim, but I do believe that the first claim is very ambiguous about making clear what are we looking for. If that is a preamble, the preamble somehow announces what will follow. That is my point. In other words, that preamble will fit any party. That's my concern. Yes, we read in certain details. Yes, you discover there is a homeschooling, sex education classes, and things of that nature that show that there is an identity in the party.
I think I kind of want to take on that question there, kind of talking more about the identity and the kind of educational philosophy.
All right.
So thinking about Mario's question and just really thinking about what our party really stands for, the two things that really stick out to me is our whole life ethic, our consistent life ethic, as well as our strong support for families. And I think especially that point right there is really, I think we place in this plank, we place a lot of emphasis on that education decision of the common good. It's not something that just affects the common good of society, but it affects the family, and that's why we place so much importance in what the educational decisions are in that of the family. So I think we really see that there is that the education is really family focused, family centered, focusing on what is going to best meet the needs of families, along with for that second point about having a consistent life ethic, a whole life ethic. I feel that kind of the overall the educational goal, like what we're hoping students get out of 12 plus years of education, at least this is just my perspective as a armchair philosopher of sorts, is that we really have an education that establishes, just how important life is, the human experience, and kind of getting back to a philosophical religious standpoint, just, the importance of our own lives and how that affects everyone else, how it affects society, and how, come back to the families, how it affects families. So I think, it's not explicitly stated in the platform anywhere. It's definitely some philosophizing there. But I think that's just something to think about, is that we're really focusing on family-centered education and a life-centered education, focus on the human experience of life.
In terms of the family's critical role, I'm sure there are a lot of people who think that the responsibility for the education of children resides primarily with the state. There certainly have been any number of governments in which the state really determined what sort of education the children would receive. And perhaps the family would be given a certain leeway in the early elementary years, but not much past then. And I wonder to what extent, we'll get to this below when we talk about sex education classes, I wonder to what extent the state is really in effect coming to say, in certain areas, we don't really trust families. We'll take this over for ourselves. And of course, there's no reason to be surprised that states would do this. If we go back to Plato's Republic, it was, of course, the idea that the families would be separated from their children. They would be separated from their children early on, so that the state could ensure the kind of education that would make the republic work. Well, all right, let's go to the second bullet point, and we can bounce around as the conversation leads us. But the second bullet point, we call for public support of both public and private schools, with a preferential option for economically disadvantaged students and an emphasis on making teaching a well-paying occupation. Once more, we call for public support of both public and private schools, with a preferential option for economically disadvantaged students and an emphasis on making teaching a well-paying occupation. Mario?
Well, I think it's a good principle, but perhaps if I'm reading these, perhaps we may need to qualify what is the support for public and what is the support for private school. The public's, I assume, is the state. So that make affordable. So the education has a population of the economically disadvantaged students. What would be the role there in the state supporting private school? I just come to my mind when I read that, the principle of subsidiarity. And so that would be interesting to see or to hear from any of you. What is the role of the principle of subsidiarity in that support, particularly support for private schools?
How about it, Skylar?
As I mentioned, vouchers is the way that a lot of education policy people think of this as government support for private school. And as far as subsidiarity goes, it probably would be good to have many of them come from the state government rather than the federal government long term.
A worry that I have, and there's no system that's free of worries, that's for sure, but a worry that I have is, I guess, based on what I read about schools in Canada. There is state support for example, Catholic schools in Canada, but there are also an increasing number of restrictions about what the Catholic schools in Canada can do, and the restrictions come from the state. And so it's a little bit of I guess, a Trojan horse thing. It seems to me that there should be public support for parochial schools, for religious schools. But I think people in religious schools have to have their eyes wide open, wide open.
A lot of people think that if the government is paying for it, they have the right to control it. So you have those, and that's one reason why a lot of the right is critical of vouchers, and then the left tends to be critical of vouchers because they're worried about it being a zero-sum game between the public schools and the private schools.
Yeah.
So that's one reason why we didn't go into as much detail about specific kinds of vouchers, is that we know it is a subject of debate in the party.
All right. So among other things, you need to have a platform that can win the support of the majority of the people in the party. So that's kind of an internal tension right there. No doubt a lot of people would have had a fuller education plank if they had only themselves to please. Now, what about this making teaching a well-paying occupation? How well-paying?
Yeah, again, that's not, we have very few numbers of that sort in the entire platform, but we're operating on the principle that in most states, teachers are not as well paid as they should be. And Brian, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yes. So, I think one reason we didn't really talk about like a specific number or a specific like percentage or anything is because, I think it plays into subsidiarity once again of every state has a different situation. What's going to work for one state might be too much or too little in a different state. So really it's up to the different state situations. But overall, looking at modern educational movements like the Red for Ed with the teacher strikes going on in different states like West Virginia that happened the past few years, we see that there's a general outcry from teachers that there's just not enough money for basic needs, basic living needs, especially when, not even just the teacher pay, but just the support given to the classrooms. Myself, I'm fortunate enough that I have not had to put much money of my own money into my classroom, but my wife, my other friends who are teachers, they have all put so much money into their own money into their classroom. So it's not even just about the pay, which would be nice to have an increase so most teachers wouldn't have to get things like a second or a third job, but as well as, we're just not spending our own money to pay for basic educational supplies. So I think it's kept pretty open-ended because we don't have a specific policy point just quite yet, as well as it does focus on the individual state and their needs. But overall, there's a huge problem in our country that we are not supporting our teachers the way we should be. For giving our children to these people, for most of the day, most of the week, there's a general attitude we don't take care of them. And being on the front lines and the trenches on that, I tend to agree with it.
Could this be a place where we could think in terms of a well-paying occupation means an occupation that would bring the teacher a family wage? If you're a
I
teacher,
believe so.
you ought to be making enough money to support your family.
Right.
Most definitely. I mean, right now, my wife and I, we're both public school teachers here in Texas. And while we do make enough money to pay the bills, it can be pretty tight at times. And we keep talking about the possibility of one of us staying at home with the kids, but with the cost of living and how much we get paid, it's just simply not an option. And we just don't make enough money where we can support a family on one paycheck. And I think that's, part of the ASP vision is that, we should have that's an option. So we can have those strong traditional nuclear families. And that includes paying a living wage to make it possible.
Right.
But what I see in this dilemma is precisely the need for the state to support education, private education. Otherwise, if there is no support because we fear influence from the state, let's say the state has a philosophy which undermines the private school philosophy about a human person, and yet we need to keep and guard this freedom, but at the same time we need that help from the state in order to keep a living wage or a decent way of living for teachers. Otherwise, it is strictly public. The prices are formed by competition, and we already know how those prices are formed, and so people are not being paid what they deserve. And so I think that is the dilemma we face, that on the one hand we need this public support, and on the other one to keep our own identity. And that's a political let's say, game in our society.
Us need to be sharper in the way we play this game, to use that expression. I think there are many groups in the country that recognize that if they're to achieve their ends, they have to, I don't want to use the word fight, but they have to advocate publicly and persistently. And so it seems to me that not anywhere near enough parents who have their children in Catholic schools, at any rate, not anywhere near enough of them are aggressive enough to challenge the states in the United States not giving any support to religious education. I think they're much more likely to be aware of how much more they could get if they sent their kids to a public school. They're much more tempted by that than they are inspired to challenge the status quo, so that the state give more support of the right sort to religious education. I think we tend to be far too passive in that regard. Well, let's go on to the next point. Teachers should be free to design their own curricula within general parameters set by local authorities. Standardized testing should not be the most significant factor in measuring the success of students and schools. So, what do you say, Brian? Do you experience pressure for standardized testing, or is it the case that in special ed that's not so much a factor?
Well, working at a Title I, but for those that may not know, Title I means low income school. We face that pressure a lot. In Texas, they say that our accountability scores and other things like funding aren't tied to test scores. But when you look at the formula set forth in state statutes, it actually is. And when you have these state tests, these standardized tests, they aren't really very effective. A recent study came out that the STAR test, it's the standardized test for the state of Texas, actually comes out at about 2 grade levels above the tested grade level. So say you're taking a 7th grade math test, it's not actually giving you 7th grade math, it's giving you 9th grade math material. And when we have that with kids that are low income, so they receive lower resources, and those with special needs who already, even with accommodations and other supports, still have a very difficult time taking these tests, the scores just don't come out very well. One article, I can't remember the publications from, but basically they said that all the STAR test does is doesn't measure student success, but it measures how poor, how disabled, and how many students of color a school has, and not actually how successful they are in a classroom. So I think it's really about that we're using these outdated, these inaccurate measures to see how successful our students are, when really the people who know how the students are doing are the teachers themselves. We've turned education from this standpoint into more of a assembly line of, okay, answer these questions, we'll put in a computer, say you did, and we'll see if you're successful or not, instead of just taking a whole holistic, whole person approach to how a student is developing in their education. So I think I put that in there. I actually wrote that part of the plank as kind of my own personal frustration with the public school system and how testing affects us so heavily. But I mean, it is valid points. I mean, we're teaching these kids, we're telling these kids that they're failing when we're giving them tests that are basically impossible to pass.
Who writes the STAR tests?
This gets into some fun stuff. So the STAR tests are written by educational companies like Pearson. So people that write textbooks and other tests. So just test writing and textbook writing companies. So of course, if Pearson's writing the test that year, then it's probably a good idea to buy the Pearson textbooks for your classroom.
Now, there are all sorts of fights, and certainly in Texas, there's this kind of fight going on about what textbooks ought to be used in the first place. So how does the dynamic work? Is there strength enough to say, look, these tests are written by people who want to sell their textbooks, and after all, we decide what textbooks we're going to have, so you folks ought to take our advice much more seriously than you do. Anything to that dynamic? Could you lobby, in other words, to change the STAR test by lobbying the people who write it, who turn out to be the educational consultants for the companies that want to sell their books?
Well, I think that is one route you could take. Now, I'm fortunate enough in my school district that we do not force our teachers to use textbooks. And as a result of that, at my school specifically, I rarely see textbooks at all. I don't see anyone using the textbooks, which really provides a more enriching educational experience for our students. But at the same time, about a month before the STAR test, we go ahead and we pop the textbooks out. We're doing reading, writing, and math exercises out of them because we know as much as we've done our own learning, our own style, our own way this whole year, we still have to go by what the test says, even though we're strongly discouraged for teaching to the test. I mean, it's one of those oxymoron, not oxymoron. It's one of those conflicts where we're being told don't teach the test, but at the same time, you got to teach to it if you want your kids to do well.
Now, another angle to consider. You teach the way you think you should be teaching. The STAR test and comparable tests in various states. The STAR test is written with a different goal in mind, different perspective. And suppose your kids don't do so well on the STAR test. Is there any help given when the STAR test diagnosis is reached? Do you get any help? Or do you actually get punished in some way?
Well, I don't think anyone will call it a punishment, but basically there's a lot of pressure put on our campus to come up with plans and strategies on how to better perform the next year. So that takes the form of, let's say, taking kids out of elective classes where they get those really fun, enriching experiences for a lot of kids. A break from just the, what's 6 times 8. And we take them out of those to do more of that, what's 6 times 8. So the pressure is really put on campuses just to perform better. The districts sort of define how to perform better. They really leave it up to the campus. But at the same time, if the campus then doesn't improve, well, it's just more consequences, especially if your scores get low enough that the state actually comes in and takes over your school or takes over your district, which usually involves a lot of firing. And the current educational trend is the state of Texas hands over your district to a charter school company. A good case of this right now is Houston ISD. They recently got a B on their district report card, which is a good score overall. But for some reason, the state of Texas is saying that's not good enough for a district the size of Houston. So they're contemplating taking it over, putting it under state control. And about a week after they said that we're thinking about doing this, one of the top charter school companies in the state made an announcement that they're expanding to Houston, with the thought being that they're just going to take over the public schools and make them their schools. So, I mean, unfortunately, with the way the school choice movement is in Texas, I mean, I'm a supporter of school choice, but here in Texas, it does have a very capitalistic bent to it, really more focused on that charter schools are companies that happen to be schools instead of schools that happen to be companies. And they use the state tests as a way to help make money with that, that's for sure, in connection with all the educational consultant companies.
Skylar, any comments on these dynamics?
Not too much to add. It's not something that I've had much experience with as an educator when it comes to teaching college classes. A lot of the pressure is often that way. But I've definitely studied this dynamic and heard a lot of concerns about it, that the standardized tests are not good for teachers, not good for students, and people's overall educational experience. And although they may seem to bring accountability, they actually cause a lot of stress without really adding very much to the education. So, and I do remember taking them myself as a kid, even like back in the late 90s. But I think they, some states have just increased their importance since then. So, I'm very glad that our advocacy against that is strengthened considerably in this platform. So
important issues to attend to, and that's being stated right here in the plank. Let me add on a couple of things, and then I'm going to enlist Mario. But just real quickly, in Inglewood, California, where I live, the school system has been such a notorious failure that the state, and Brian suggests this can happen in Texas, the state did take over our school district. And one of the reasons why it took over the school district was financial. But after the state took over the school district, the finances became manifestly worse. And I don't think the educational level of the students has in any visible way improved. And when you have this, a kind of a collapse of a whole school system, and it's taken over by the state, what happens, among other things, the ironies, is in our last mayoral race, the candidates running for mayor said, oh, yeah, we want to be mayor of Inglewood, but we have nothing to do with the schools, so we're not going to discuss the schools. And they didn't. So you have one failure compounded by another failure. I guess Inglewood is in some respects a worst case scenario, but
Yeah.
What you have is
That
the
does-
state
does bring-
taking over and doing a worse job than the local group were doing. Mario,
That does bring up
please.
an interesting point because I guess I'll say one thing quickly that a lot of people have an interest in ASP members running for school board, and there is one ASP member running for school board right now in Idaho, actually, James McMillan, but I guess also with the support of his local Republican Party. But there will be a lot of interesting discussions about how exactly will an ASP school board member act differently than anybody else, and that could be for a whole other show.
Right. Mario.
Well, all of the observation you were making, I think, are very, very interesting and appropriate because that show that education is not neutral. It's not a neutral enterprise because school instruct children, whether implicit or explicitly, whether with this curriculum, another curriculum, but through that they inject or they propose meaning, a purpose, and a good life or self-interest. So I think that is, the great job of a political party, which affirms certain pluralism in education, which means no neutrality in education, so that private enterprises can have their own identity, and that need to be balanced with the funding, which is precisely a political conflict. And so ultimately, that is why I think it's very important for the American Solidarity Party to focus on education, because education ultimately it's a political enterprise. In terms of focus on the common good, the good of society.
Not easy to do all of this, and it's not going to be any easier as we go to the next bullet point. Local school systems should reconsider the overuse of technology in the classroom.
Yes.
How about some particulars on that? I can think of one, but I'm sure the rest of you can as well.
All right, I think I'd like to chime on this one. So recently
Again,
did.
Go ahead.
Okay, so recently, as part of my certification program that I did, I had to become a fully certified teacher in Texas. I had to submit lesson plans to the program I was doing it with, and a required part of these lesson plans was how do I adapt technology to the classroom? How do I integrate technology to the classroom? For some of them, it was pretty easy to do so. Luckily, we do have some pretty cool educational technology systems in our district. But at the same time, with other lessons that I had to write, I was just like, I don't really understand how I need to integrate technology in here. I mean, when simply just using your body or using pen and paper will suffice. So I think we push technology too much just to be like, oh, look, we have this awesome technology. We're cutting edge. We're on top of the game. When really we're not evaluating the actual educational need of that technology. I mean, I want to say it's a passing fad, but with how much we've been pushing it, I feel like it's not going to be the fad we thought it was. And with that, I mean, we just have to really reevaluate what is the instructional purpose of technology in the classroom. Because when I go get evaluated, I don't want to be knocked off for not using technology when, I mean, it's not really relevant to the thing I'm teaching. So I think that's something that's what that plank really tackles, and something that we need to keep in mind in our educational thoughts and philosophies.
Right. Yeah, so I had really wanted to see that plank added. It's a lot of friends who have been involved in education or thought a lot about philosophy of education have really pointed out to me how much technology in the classroom, as well as other places, for technology for children has resulted in a lot of kids being addicted to screens, and also losing a lot of skills that they would have gained fairly naturally in previous generations. So, yeah, and of course, how much to change things back is a question where there would be a lot of debate, but I thought at least adding something about it at least would make people think.
I think the use of technology is getting to a place where technology is driven almost everything in the classroom. I have experience of teaching in a classroom where there were at least 5 screens on the walls. And so the teacher almost disappeared. And that is disappear in the sense that he is almost unnecessary. So there is no human relationship. Everything is being measured by some objective way of measurement, and that perhaps remind me a book that I read and sometimes I use in class to discuss this issue. A book was published in the 1990s by social critic Neil Postman. The title is The Surrender of Culture to Technology, and he called about the culture which is in the 90s, he said is coming, is the culture of technopolis, where technology will somehow absorb culture in such a way that give culture its order, its measurement, the way that people fulfill themselves. And it seems that we are getting to that place in education today.
Postman is very good, isn't he? He has another book called Entertaining Ourselves to Death.
Exactly, yes.
Well, let's go on to the next bullet point. I see, once again, I've never known a show, one of our podcasts, that this hasn't happened with. We're only halfway down our list, and we've got a grand total of, in theory at least, 7 minutes left. Happens every time.
I think I need to head out a bit early as well. So I have an unstable internet connection and dinner is ready. But it really has been great to be in the conversation.
We'll require, Skylar, before you try to go on to another adventure, that you say something first about the next point. Local school systems should undertake initiatives that expand education beyond reading, writing, mathematics, science, social studies, and the arts. That's a lot, and then we want to expand on that. Additional subjects should include virtue and citizenship, understanding of the natural world, agriculture, trades, life skills, and useful crafts. How will we do all of that? Skylar, before you head stage left, you answer that question.
Yes, it's aspirational. Of course, some school districts are doing a lot of that, at least for some students, but it's just meant to be a reminder that as much as most of us are kind of nerds in the party, we enjoy reading and history and science and all that, but people need to know to exercise all parts of their mind and all parts of their body. And the educational system needs to facilitate that happening so people pass skills on from generation to generation.
Well, I know one person who's very interested in the musical arts. Isn't that so?
Yes. I was.
For all we know, you're off to choir practice.
Tomorrow, yes.
Aha! So
and I was in band and piano in school, not choir. But it gave me the skills to join choir later when the opportunity for that came up.
Aha! All right. Well, thanks very much for being with us. Now, Brian, I want to ask you, since we have just a little time left, to tell us something that's come to be important for you, especially given your work in special education. One of my sons was in special education. My mother was a special education teacher. Could you give us a little of your experience and your thinking with regard to that?
Well, really, as a special education educator, a teacher, the thing that I really think about or focused on mainly is the educational outcomes for the student. What exactly is their goal? I know right now a lot of schools, both public and private, they're pushing to go to college for your traditional tertiary education. But I mean, obviously, for a lot of people in special that have those special education services, that simply isn't an option. We got to think about what is best going to serve the student and how can we tailor that education to meet their needs and meet their goals. So that was really one thing I was thinking about when trying to write this platform with Skylar, this section with Skylar, was not only about how do we make this a family-centric education platform, but how do we make it a student-centered, a student-focused educational platform? Because at the end of the day, when we're talking about teaching, I mean, that's who we're really focusing on. I mean, we're not doing it for the money, obviously. We're not doing it for the fame or prestige. We're doing it because we love the kids and we want to have what's best for them and have the best life they can have, to be good citizens of society, be good family members, good spouses and parents, but just overall have lives that, you know, we see the worth in their lives. I think especially with special education, since students who have disabilities are often targeted in the womb, I think showing their worth through their education is vitally important from a pro-life perspective that fits in with the needs of our party, as well as just taking care of the needs of these people who are so disadvantaged by the random chance of life. So I think it's really important to have that student-focused perspective.
And what kind of special support are you getting in Texas for students with these extraordinary needs?
Well, it depends a lot on the individual district, the individual classroom. I mean, because the range of disability ranges so much from those who just have trouble with reading comprehension to those who are stuck at the mental age of an infant. I mean, it depends a lot on your individual situation with the kid, which is partially enshrined in federal education law. I say that's one of the very few areas where the federal government did do a decent job, was federal special education law. That's a very rare example. Let's see, I lost my train of thought.
Well, do you have lower class sizes, for example?
Oh, yes. For students that need a more specialized instruction, we definitely go for lower class sizes. My job exactly as a special education teacher, I provide inclusion support. So what I do is I go in and I assist students in a regular classroom, because studies show that when you put these special education students in the regular general education classroom, if it works for them, that actually is better than just cording them off in their own separate classroom. So my job there is...
Does anyone call you the shadow?
Sometimes a lot of teachers think I'm an aide and not an actual teacher, so I have to correct them with that. But yeah, I'm just in there supporting the kids where they need support. That way, I mean, at the end of the day, it doesn't even seem like they have a disability, which is the overall goal, you know, that working towards that independence, being an independent person, able to do what they want to do in life that gives their life meaning and worth.
Well, it's a wonderful vocation that you have.
Oh, thank you.
Mario, last thoughts?
Well, I think it's the discussion is fascinating, and I see after all this discussion and reading the platform how necessary is a party like the American Solidarity Party, which has a very clear idea of what to do and what are the needs of society, beginning with the human person in the family. And from that, we can need to expand our good news, I think, in the political landscape.
All right. Well, that's why this party is important, and that's why we're going to keep on doing what we're doing, and we're going to do it better, and we're going to do it with vim and gusto and insight. Well, we always close with a prayer, and ordinarily I take the gospel for the day, but yesterday the Catholic Church came to have a new canonized saint who had a lot to say about education, John Henry Newman. And Newman is the first English saint to be canonized in modern times. There are English saints, but they date back, way back to the martyrs under Henry and Elizabeth. But in the last couple of centuries, John Henry Newman, the first of the English saints that we have now. And I'm going to read something that's written in Victorian style, and it's a wonderful style, and it's quite well known. It's called Lead, Kindly Light. Lead, kindly light, amid the encircling gloom. Lead me thou on. The night is dark, and I am far from home. Lead thou me on, keep thou my feet. I do not ask to see the distant scene. One step is enough for me. I was not ever thus, nor prayed that thou shouldst lead me on. I love to choose and see my path. But now lead thou me on. I love the garish day, and spite of fears, pride ruled my will. Remember not past years. So long your power hath blessed me, sure it still will lead me on, o'er moor and fen, o'er crag and torrent, till the night is gone, and with the morn those angel faces smile, which I have loved long since and lost a while. Amen. Come, Lord Jesus, come.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.